government waste as a resource, a role for traceability. So I wanted to talk about that fairly generally. I know some of the other segments are a little bit more focused on particular issues, but I wanted to talk generally and where some of the opportunities for traceability are with the government's investment in waste. So if you could just move us on to the first slide. Not having me in control of the slides and the screens is a good thing. I just sort of base you in where we're coming from in terms of the government. A national waste policy that was released in 2018, and it talked about the circular economy there. It's been quite a significant investment by government in waste. For those of you who've been following it, certainly, and I've been around a little bit over a year in this role, but certainly in the last 2 years, there's been a significant investment from government in waste and recycling. So you may have heard it talked about over $1 billion investment. That in turn is going to create a really good benefit for the economy, but also for the environment. And that's what the circular economy is about. You've heard lots of good stories. Everyone would have heard lots of, bad stories about where the environment meets the economy. It's usually something like a mining site or somewhere where the economy is pushing on and it's causing damage in the environment. It might also be about when roads or buildings are being put down and there's some impact on the environment or the species or an endangered species in that area. So there's lots of bad stories around about the environment and the economy. This is a good one because it's a nice little balancing between both things. The economy, so driving the economy forward, investing in infrastructure to deal with recycling, investing in people's circularity of their products, creating jobs, but also looking after the environment because we're not relying as much on virgin material. So it's a nice little space, waste and recycling, in terms of it's a good story around where the economy meets the environment. It's one we can all relate to, and it's one that is certainly becoming more topical and more discussed and more advanced, not just in Australia, but around the world. So it is something that I think is a nice little area for investment and development and improvement in the technology around this space. So the National Waste Policy was put together in 2018. What followed from that, and that was obviously to focus on the circular economy, and if you take us to the next slide, what followed that was a National Waste Policy Action Plan. So that was released in 2019, well, late 2019, I think it was, and it was at the old COAG, the Council of Australian Government. So it was a plan that had been signed up by the Commonwealth, by all the states and territories, and by local government. So it was basically every level of government committing to action around waste and recycling. And for those of you who haven't seen it, it basically has 7 targets, which are listed there, and I'll just really briefly take you through them. But there's 80 actions in there. And I'm not going to take you through those 80 actions, but let's just say there's quite a lot of detail and quite a lot of work to get through. It takes us through to 2030. So it's basically the next 10, well, we're down now, 9 years of what needs to be achieved in this space. So it is ambitious, but there is funding that's been made available from all levels of governments to sort of implement these ambitious targets. I suppose the one good thing about it is it gives us something to aim at, and if we do all right, I've at least got a job to 2030, and hopefully that we're on the right side of the numbers when we get to there. But just quickly, those 7 targets, and I'm not going to take you in any detail because there's quite a lot in there, is you might have heard the export bans. So the idea there is we shipped a lot of our waste offshore to China, other countries in Asia, who would not always do the right thing with it in terms of recycling. It might have been burnt, buried. So banning the export of plastic, paper, glass and tyres and a gradual banning of that means we need to take responsibility in Australia, which means we need to do something with it. We don't want to just landfill it here. We want to build the infrastructure. We want to build the capability to be able to deal with it. So that was the important thing about the waste export. And you would have heard stuff about that recently, because from 1 July, mixed plastics are no longer being able to be exported without a licence. The other one's about reducing waste generated in Australia 10% by person, 80% average resource recovery rate from all waste streams. And those of you familiar with all the waste streams, there's some that have quite a lot of work to do, particularly in the area of plastic, but also in areas, and depending again which state and territory you're looking at, it may be the municipal curbside services, it may be in construction and demolition, but to hit 80% average across Australia for all waste streams, we're currently, just so you know, about 60% roughly. So there's still a bit of work to do in terms of hitting that resource recovery rate. Importantly, if we're keeping our waste onshore and we're increasing our recovery rate, we need demand for recycled content. So number 4, the target is about increasing the use of recycled content. So examples of that are things like, you would have seen park benches made of recycled plastic. You would have seen potentially glass, recycled glass, plastic in roads and road constructions, trials of that, boardwalks, bollards, decking. There's all types of things, but increasing the use of recycled contents by government and industry. Number 5, phase out problematic and unnecessary plastics, that the bane of the oceans and others. So that's an important part as well. Plus also halving the amount of organic waste sent to landfill. So that's one of the waste streams we need to work on. It's quite a bit of garden and food organics that goes into landfill, and the methane that results of it is quite a significant, or there is a level of that that contributes to the greenhouse gases. So addressing that organic waste is important. Another thing is about data, having information available so people can track, number 1, how we're going on our targets, but also how things are moving in the economy, where the resources are, what's available, so people, the consumers, can make investments and policy decisions based on that. So there's 80 actions. I'm not going to take you through them, but that's the 7 targets. So, and that takes us to 2030, and there's quite a bit of money being invested by all levels of government to achieve those. If we move on to the next slide, it's sort of like I'm in sales at the moment, but there's more. So in the recent budget that was just announced in May, there's another $78 million on top of all the investments previously that help with that waste action plan. So I talked about food organics and garden organics and methane from landfill. There is a $67 million investment to improve the collection and use of that resource. There's a thing called the National Product Stewardship Investment Fund, quite successful fund, and that's about brands, businesses, producers taking responsibility for their products from design through to collection and end of life and recycling back through. Some of the ones you may have heard of are things like mobile muster. There's ones that we've recently approved for bag recovery in agriculture. So there's quite a few product stewardship investments being made, and there was another 6 million for that. And the last one was 5 million to help with supporting small business, who are the ones that are a little bit more difficult to find the time and effort to sort of dedicate themselves to adopting the ARL, which is this Australasian recycling label. So 5 million to help small businesses put the effort and time in and support them to be able to adopt the ARL and increase the presence of the ARL in the shops when you go in there and seeing it. I know I look for it and I shop, but there's still a lot of other products that need to have the ARL sort of put on, so money to support that as well. So if we take us to the next slide, is really where the discussion I wanted to have today, or sort of put on the table, is when I look through the 7 targets and 80 actions, I reckon I can link every single one to some form of traceability. I'm not going to do that in front of you today because we haven't got enough time, but there's heaps of opportunities. Anyone that does look at the National Waste Policy Action Plan, there is lots of different opportunities for traceability. Just a couple of things that sort of in my background that I've had experience with traceability. The first one is I come from the ag side of the department, as was mentioned earlier there by David. I remember at the time I wasn't necessarily working in the area, but I knew about what was going on. It was when the melons had the contamination, and I remember I called some pretty big problems, and the traceability was an issue then. I know they've done a lot since then to fix it up, but I remember talking to the area involved, and they were saying, you know, at any point in the supply chain, we can sort of go, you know, one step back or maybe one step forward. But when you've got multiple players across the supply chain, it's very difficult to work out where it came from. And they said even more difficult sometimes is, and depending on who plays in the supply chain, is you might be able to trace back where it come from and work that out. But then to work out where it went back through the supply chain is another challenge altogether. So that sort of stuck with me when I remember talking to the guys who were working on that issue there a couple of years ago to do with the melons. More closer to home, my kids love traceability. So they are in their rooms on their computers all the time, online shopping, and they put in their order and it comes out of somewhere in the world and they watch it travel across the world till it's delivered to the front door. So they love traceability because they can see where their package is coming from and when it's going to arrive. Then I usually complain to them when they pull off the 16 layers of plastic and then undo all the stuff and then go, what am I going to do with this? I say, well, you need to recycle that. Or my young fella looks at it and goes, oh, it's the wrong size. And then he gets me to print out a label to send it back all the way. And then he tracks that as it goes back. And I said, why don't you just order the right size to start with? He goes, because I like watching it go around everywhere. So he quite enjoys the traceability. He doesn't like it though when I switch on his Find My iPhone and I see when he says he's at the library and he's really at his mate's house. So it sort of cuts both ways with the traceability, but a lot of people can relate to it and it makes sense. Whereas I use it for, well, my kids use it for tracking all their online shopping around the world. I use it to track them and make sure they're doing the right thing, although I get in trouble with that as well. Anyway, I digress. The things that I think there are opportunities for traceability is the national packaging targets. And there's others here who'll talk a little bit more about those after, but for those of you who know about the national packaging targets, I'll just say them really quickly. So this is for all packaging by 2025, that 100% is reusable, recyclable and compostable. The phase out of problematic and unnecessary single use. 70% of packaging being recycled or composted. And here's the one I think that's really important. It's 50% average recycled content included in packaging. Really important one. That's a tough one because you've got all sorts of issues with using recycled content in packaging, particularly when it comes to food safety, but also in guaranteeing that the recycled content that you may be using in your packaging, where it comes from, what processes it's been through, and whether or not the product is what it holds out to be, I can think only can be done through traceability, particularly when it's to do with food safety. Very important. But also likewise, there'll be, because this is an increasingly big space in terms of circular economy and reusing packaging and recycling packaging, claims of recyclability will need to be tested along the way. And where people say, if you pick it up off the shelf and say, oh, this has got 50% recycled content, excellent. But how do you really know that's the case? So there's a big element potentially for fraud there, but it's important to know where recycled content comes from, but also to be able to validate it. The second area I wanted to sort of touch on, and if you look through the action plan, that national packaging targets is certainly a big element, but it touches on quite a number of those topics. In terms of other areas in the action plan that I think lend itself to traceability, there's a big focus on increasing government procurement of recycled content. So again, I talked about that drives demand. So we're keeping the waste on shore, we're investing in the infrastructure, but we don't want, you know, warehouses full of recycled content ready to be used, but no one's demanding it and buying it. So again, the government's leading the way. We've updated our procurement policies to say we need to take into account sustainability and whole of life costs and recyclability or recycled content. So increasingly government will be looking for those products and again, we need to know that those products are made of recycled content, and we know how they are, and traceability systems gives us that, let alone the whole accreditation and standards that would sit around the recycled content for government procurement. So not just in packaging, but in everything we buy. Likewise, the export ban, which I talked about, I can see the role of traceability. With us banning the government, Australian government Australia banning the export of our waste, there is still markets overseas for recycled inputs. So there is certain things like processed plastic flakes or refined glass fines that may make its way overseas. I think to be able to do that, you'll need to have a license, and you'll need to validate where it's come from and where it's going to as part of the application process. So traceability, or the increasing technology around traceability of the materials, will help with that process. I think there's quite an opportunity there in terms of making that process a little bit easier. I have got a couple more I want to share with you before I'll stop and let you move on to the next one. There's quite a bit being done in terms of standards. I talked about it earlier in terms of standards for whether it's at the curbside, so where it's collected, but also when it gets to a materials sorting factory, or we call them MRFs, materials recovery facility, or into a remanufacturer. So there's standards that are set for what goes in and then what comes out of each of those parts of the supply chain. Certainly anything around showing you're meeting standards and traceability, you can see the linkages straight away. But also further than that, just with the MRFs, or the material recovery facilities, and the remanufacturers, systems, their technology for sorting, whether it's optical scanners, whatever it might be, being able to recognise something from a label that's on a product as terms of where it came from, how many times it's been through the system, where it originated from, I can see help in sorting as well into the right streams, which helps. Hopefully we all know that the cleaner the streams are, the easier they are to sort into single polymer or single material, the easier it is to recycle. It's only when you get the contamination and all the things mixing together. So anything that makes it easier to sort into single streams will only increase our recovery rates and hit our targets in the National Waste Policy Action Plan. I might just finish then with the last one, and I think it's increasingly becoming the linkage I want to draw here with the action plan. It's becoming increasingly expected in other countries. So the international movement along these lines is something we keep an eye on. So, for example, the one that off the top of my head would be the plastics tax they're talking about in the UK, that they're saying, and I might get this wrong, I think it's something like for anything that has less than 30% of recycled content, there's a tax associated, whether it's domestic or imported. So that system, I think, is coming into place soon, if it's not already. I should be a little bit closer to it. But I can see there being able to validate the taxes and do the accreditation and do the auditing around that claim or claims of 30% recyclable product would benefit greatly from traceability efforts, whether it be in labelling or some other way, or some new technology. So it's increasingly being used around the world, not just the circular economy and the principles of the circular economy, but how we actually gear up to enable this flow of a resource in a circular way and keep track of things, particularly when it's to do with food safety, and particularly when it's to do with growing our economy and giving people assurances around markets, and that the claims that are being made stand up to a very robust system.